Hello, Victoria. This is Glynnis Hagins, and I'm responding to your Module 2 reflection response. I want to go ahead and apologize if I look down. I've written out some notes, and so I wanted to make sure that I addressed everything that I saw in your reflection and that I really enjoyed. The first thing that you talked about was boredom due to lack of challenge, and I definitely agree with that. I think that oftentimes we as teachers find ourselves looking at a classroom full of bored students, especially if they're gifted and talented. Many of my own gifted and talented students in my standard English class were often bored because they weren't challenged enough. When differentiated for, however, they did well on assignments. And so it's interesting to see that when the students are challenged, that they actually take the time and they enjoy what they're doing. But if we don't challenge them, then they can become bored, and then a whole number of issues can arise, and we've got to work towards that, which luckily we are, since we're in an AIG add-on licensure program. You also talked about the quote in the textbook that being gifted and talented often is associated with a presumed sense of positive self-esteem. I've seen recently on websites like Tumblr and other blogs that adults formerly labeled as gifted complain often about being labeled as gifted, which is really sad because I wasn't labeled gifted, but I know that I was. I went to private school, and at my private school, we didn't have those labels. And so to hear someone else who went to a public school who had that label talk about their experience and seeing that now as adults, when they reflect back, they feel like they were mislabeled and do not possess any of the gifts or talents that they were told they possessed as children, I think about the quote in the text that Joyce Van Tassel Bosca writes that gifted students may have some feelings of inadequacy, called the imposter syndrome by some. This can be a huge issue that gifted and talented students have to grapple with, especially as we are preparing them for life and adulthood. And if we're not preparing them for life, and then we've got to think about what this label should mean to them 20 years from now. And so I don't know if I have any ideas or suggestions, but I do want to point out that every year I work for DoTip, which is why I have my lanyard on, and I interact with a tipster or two who thinks she's dumb because her brothers call her stupid, or thinks she shouldn't be here at the camp because she's definitely not gifted, and it's some miracle that she's here. In the past, I was a residential counselor, which is an RC, so all of my groups were girls, and it kind of broke my heart because as a person who's all girl power, to hear these girls say, well, I don't think I belong here, or I think that my teacher told everyone that I was smarter than I actually am, and it really breaks my heart to see that. But this year, as an administrative role, I've gotten to see that boys this age feel the same way. I'm working with rising 6th and 7th graders, and to hear, of course, middle school is a really tough time for all students, but for these gifted students to say, well, I've been mislabeled all through elementary school, I think that I'm not as smart as I actually am, is really disappointing and tough to grapple with. But I've had some boys, like I said, who share the sentiment of feeling inadequate or like an imposter. And like I said, that's tough, and I don't know if I have any solutions besides just reassuring students that they're supposed to be here, which is always what I did as an RC and what I've done this year as an admin, as a person in the admin team for the camp, that like, if I'm talking to a student, you belong. You're here for a reason. Even if you may think that that reason is not true or is not adequate, you're here because you're smart and you're intelligent and you're capable of so much more than you probably can even know. So I always try to work towards that potential that the students possess. Finally, talking about social acceptance and friendship. That's a big deal among the gifted population. Last week at camp, I had a tipster who really felt like he was the weirdest person at the camp. And I'm like, there's no way that that's possible. But at the same time, he really felt that way. Like, he knew he was beyond weird and that there was no way that he could become normal enough to hang out with the in crowd. At Duke Tip, there really is no in crowd, especially among the boys, but he really felt that he was weird. Towards the end of the week, however, at our final hurrah for the residential programming, he was asked at Carnival if someone could play with him. This little boy came up to him and was like, "Can I play with you?" And I just thought that was the most adorable thing, thinking about where he was at the beginning of the week of camp. But just in the conversation that I had with him, he was concerned about fitting in. He had expressed an idea that had tanked, and he felt that there was no recovering from that because A, he was an imposter and he wasn't supposed to be here, and B, he's very weird, and that's not okay. So again, with the positive reassurance and making sure that he knows that there is no situation that is too difficult for you to come back from. And then on the flip side of that, you have the underachievement for acceptance. I personally am under the idea that we should nurture all students' gifts so that achievement is the norm, instead of achievement being some weird thing like, oh, you get pulled out every day to go to Miss So-and-so's class. That clearly means you're weird. Instead of that being the idea that achievement instead is the idea, and that teachers are nurturing all students' gifts. The young boy that you talked about, I feel so sorry for him. I feel like, there's that borderline, and I've taught several students like this. As a high school teacher, I get to teach the football players, and I had a whole class full of them my fall semester for 2016. And one boy in particular, I talked to his mom, I talked to every caring adult in this boy's life, but he seemed to be under the impression that if he acts out, if he pretends to play dumb, that's going to make him cooler in the long run and not a wimp or some type of person who's weird for being smart. He ended my class in the 70s and was very upset that he had ended in the 70s, but it was kind of too late. When you've averaged an A, B, and then you don't do well in the final exam, you don't do well in the final 9 weeks, it's difficult to come back from. But he didn't realize that. He was too busy trying to impress his friends. His mother called him a class clown. Like, it was a huge situation. But I understand what you're talking about with the young boy that you mentioned. I have a cousin who was in a similar boat. He actually ended up doing way beyond. He's off in college now, studying political science. But when he first transferred from private school to public school, he faced a similar situation where he had to dumb himself down to look cool to his peers. At the private school he went to, they used the Abeka curriculum, which, at least according to my mother, who's also an educator, that's a few grade levels above most school textbooks. And so he was coming into public school years ahead. He also was labeled gifted, and so to see him dumb himself down to fit other people's standards of cool was really disappointing. He didn't misbehave, but at the same time, it's crazy to think that children will do anything possible to be normal, even if it's not normal to us adults. So my thought process is that as adults, we should establish some type of cultural norm, whether in our classrooms or in the school environment, or even as a district as a whole, we can establish a cultural norm of achievement, that achievement academically is our goal, and we show that through our own achievements. I always shared with my students my own grade point average in high school and my own grade point average in college, to which some students are like, oh my gosh, you're such a nerd. But for the most part, those students really are like, wow, if Miss Hagins can do it, then so can I. So I think that it is our responsibility as educators to create a norm of achievement instead of a norm of we're passing you forward. And I think now that policies are starting to change towards achievement and not just testing achievement, that we may see some turnaround in that with grade levels in the future. But I teach high school, so I'm not quite sure if that's true or not. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about that you discussed was the lack of motivation, or apathy, as my mentor teacher called it when I was doing my student teaching a couple of years ago. We are seeing, at least at the high school level, a huge number of students who are not highly motivated. Like, I hear teachers, veteran teachers at my school, talk about how it used to be you would have a lot of students aiming for A's and B's, and rarely would you ever get those students who are C/D students. They said the last two classes of ninth graders that we've had, at least in my time there, I've only taught there for 2 years, that the students are coming in not motivated, not ready to learn. They're coming in aiming for C's, even D's. Now that 60 is passing, they're aiming for 60s, and that we're not seeing students as motivated as they used to be. And so that makes me wonder, what is that for gifted students? What does that mean? In my district, I don't teach AIG students yet. I'm going to teach honors in the fall, but at the same time, the kids who are labeled gifted sometimes end up taking standard classes because, oh, the standard class is going to be easy. And I feel like if you're highly motivated, you're not going to try to take the easy route. You're going to try to take the route that is most challenging for you. So I'm interested to see if, like I said, policy changes or changes in culture change the way that we approach the lack of motivation and change the way students feel about their own learning and their own growth in education. Thank you for sharing your response, and I really appreciate and learned a lot from your response. Thank you, Victoria, and I hope you have a wonderful day.